December 31, 1971 to December 31, 1972 was my tour of duty in South Vietnam. Even though I returned to the United States at the end of November 1972 because our unit had been closed and disbanded at the end of, the end of October 1972. We essentially stopped bombing at the end of 1972. It was November 1972 before I came back to the United States. This is John Hauser. My channel is Free Advice, and I am going to give out a little bit of free advice with what I'm about to say. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about my adventures. The adventures of John Hauser in South Vietnam. As I've told you in prior videos, I was a crew chief on an A-37B. The A-37B had variations. There was the T-37, which I knew what a T-37 was because where I was stationed at prior, they had T-37s. It was just a small trainer. Then they had the A-37, which was one of the original attack fighters that they started using. But then there was the A-37B, and the A-37B had larger engines. It had the J-85 GE engines, same engines you would find in the F-5s or in the T-38s. It had larger wings. The wingspan was 37 feet, tip to tip. Now think of that. The wingspan was 37 feet, tip to tip. But the fuselage was only 17 feet long. The fuselage was really about the size of an average car, 17 feet. So 17 feet fuselage, 37-foot wingtip to wingtip, this beefed up heavy-duty wing, because this plane was designed to carry very heavy payloads, including lots of fuel, and was designed to do its work at 1,000 feet or less, often at treetop level. I arrived there at Bien Hoa, South Vietnam, very early in January of 1972. And again, my orders were not clear, but I got introduced to the A-37B there at Bien Hoa, and I was assigned my own airplane, my own jet. They put my name on one side of it, the pilot's name on the other side of it. And at the time, I was 21 and a half years old. And right now, I'm working on 76. So the information that I'm reviewing is 54 years old. So after 54 years, it's a little sketchy. The information I give may not be in chronological order, but it will all have to do with 1972. So in 1972, I'm stationed at Bien Hoa Air Base, which was shared by the United States Air Force and the Vietnamese and the 7th Cavalry with their helicopters. It also included C-130 gunships, the Spectres, the Goonie Birds, and the A-1Es. These were propeller-driven airplanes. And I'll talk more about those eventually, maybe. But I didn't work on those. I just worked on the A-37B. Now, while I was there at Bien Hoa, I met a young man. His name was Tim. Tim made a real impression on me. Tim was a real Christian. Now, I'm not talking about just somebody that says, oh, I go to church, or I'm religious, or something like that. Tim was a real Christian, and he placed these small comic books in different areas. I think they're put out by Chick, and I think they're called Chick Tracts, but these little comic books, and I would read them, but I didn't know where they came from. And one day I was working on my jet. I was in the revetment working on my jet, and Tim came up. He was driving a tow motor, similar to a forklift, except we used them to tow the planes around with. And he came up to me, he asked me a couple of questions. He asked me if I was a Christian, if I was saved, if I had accepted Christ as my Savior. I said no to all of the above because I was not a Christian. I was just a regular GI like everybody else that was there. And so I wasn't a Christian. And he got back on the tow motor and left, and I really didn't think any more about it until 1974, when I had been transferred to a base in North Carolina, and I was at that time working on F-4s, and I met Charlie Yunkin. Now, any of you out there that have heard of Charlie Yunkin, he passed away in 2014, but we met in 1974. Also a gentleman by the name of Lynn Sykes and a gentleman by the name of Paul Moody. And I'll go into more detail about that as I go along. But eventually, here's what happened. Eventually, I myself became a Christian. And now, not while I was in Vietnam. It wasn't while I was in Vietnam, and it's not because I went to Vietnam. A friend of mine told me one time, he said, oh, you had a foxhole conversion. No, that's not what happened. Because it was in 1974, and I will give you more details on that taking place. But in 1974, my wife and I, we both accepted Christ as our Savior, and we both became Christians, and we've been Christians since 1974. How many years is that? It's 52 years. So, back to Vietnam. While I was in Vietnam, I did the same thing all the other soldiers and the GIs did. I lived exactly the same kind of lifestyle. We worked from 6 in the morning. We had to be on the flight line at 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. It was 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and you were supposed to get a day off, but sometimes it was just a half a day. So they were some pretty long days. They were, like, say, 6 to 6. Then the night crew would come in, and they'd work from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. They would do the nighttime maintenance on these jets. Now, I have posted a video that's kind of rough, but it does show you what these jets look like. They carried regular, traditional heart bombs. They carried a machine gun, a minigun, 7.62 millimeter, could fire 1,000 rounds a minute. They carried rocket bombs, napalm. Yes, we used napalm. And a lot of times we weren't supposed to say napalm. They said the category has been changed to explosive jelly. It was napalm. I've seen it leak out of the canisters and onto the ground. And anyhow, we used napalm. And we used some, what they call personnel bombs and some other things. But I want to talk to you just a minute about the pilots. Now, as a crew chief, more or less a jet mechanic, we were on the ground, we were on the base, we had the Marines guarding the perimeter. But the pilots of these planes, they were a completely different breed of person, a completely different type of person. Imagine getting into one of these small jets, flying at 375 miles an hour, roughly. You're flying along at around 1,000 feet or so. The enemy is spotted. You're called in. The OV-10s would call in the locations, the forward air controllers. You would drop down below 1,000 feet, often to treetop level. And I know it was treetop level because we actually lost one or two that flew into a palm tree. At treetop level, you come screaming in, and you drop your bombs and your rockets and your napalm on the enemy. And you're coming in so fast they can't shoot you down. At 375 miles an hour, you're maybe 75, maybe 150, 200 feet in the air. They can't see you coming. They can't hear you coming because you're coming in so fast, and you get right on top of them and you blow them up. But every now and then, we would lose a plane to ground fire. And I'll tell you some more of that as I go along. But just think of what it took for these pilots to get into those jets every day and fly right into the face of danger. We were on the ground, we were mechanics, we didn't have anybody shooting at us unless it was a rocket attack, but these guys had people shooting at them every single day.